if they have got something bringing to the table, I'm all ears. It's just that all I'm hearing again is, or what I've seen on this channel, because I don't really follow the news, is just kind of accusations. I'm not one that kind of listens wholeheartedly to accusations. I'll always hear people out, but you got to follow it up more than that. It can't just be a shot in the dark. Well, this might have happened. Well, it might not have happened though. So what have you got to suggest that it does? Because what you said's pretty bold. Let's see what you've got to kind of back that up.
It's how bold it is, which is surprising. On how things have progressed. So last week we were talking about the election. We were talking about how the votes are decided. There's no real evidence to say that there isn't any significant evidence to say that there was a fraudulent election and that Biden won through this mass cheating campaign. This week I saw recently Rand Paul. So Rand Paul is, I don't know if he's a senator or a congressman, not sure. But President-elect Biden is now confirmed by the Electoral College. It's certified. He is going to be the next president. And the Trump team is still fighting the fight. And people who are in higher positions of power, in my view, are still gaslighting. And I want to play something that I saw earlier this week from Rand Paul, which I just think it's irresponsible, in my opinion. I think it's just saying shit.
But the fraud.
Let me put that on the screen for you to see, though.
Yeah, let's have a look at this. So I'm coming at this special.
The election in many ways was stolen, and the only way it'll be fixed is by, in the future, reinforcing the laws. And the only last comment I would say on what Mr. Krebs, and he can speak for himself, but I think his job was keeping the foreigners out of the election. It was the most secure election based on security of the internet and technology. But he never has voiced an opinion. He's welcome to today on whether or not dead people voted. I don't think he examined that. Did he examine non-citizens voting? So to say it was the safest election, sure, I agree with your statement if you're referring to foreign intervention. But if you're saying it's the safest election based on no dead people voted, no non-citizens voted, no people broke the absentee rules, I think that's false. And I think that's what's upset a lot of people on our side, is that they're taking your statement to mean, oh, well, there was no problem in the elections. I don't think you examined any of the problems that we've heard here. So really, you're just referring to something differently is the way I look at it.
So interestingly, I think he played.
What's been brought forward then?
Nothing.
Does he have evidence that counters that's got dead people's names on that have been voted? What's he got?
So I went back and just double checked because I did a lot of research in Georgia, and this was in relation to Georgia. And Georgia's having what's called a runoff because the election was, I think, a dead heat, or it was too. I forget. There's a certain percentage. If you don't win by a certain percentage of votes, I think it's for the state representation, then you have to rerun. And in Georgia, he's making the claim that people haven't checked if dead people or foreigners have voted. And they're also making the claim that there's no signature check and identification. And if you just do a cursory Google search on the state's website or anywhere, you just search voting in Georgia, you need to, if you go and vote in person, you need to have a voter ID, which in some states is considered a bit of a deterrent for people that are, let's say, poor or uneducated to go and vote, because not everybody has ID who maybe isn't in a higher economic position. But if you wanted to get a mail-in ballot, you also have to provide your driver's license or identification number on that ballot, on that application for a ballot before you send it in, and then you have to send a signature. So they need something to compare the signature to. So that claim, where I keep struggling with this is it's certified, it's done. And he's making claims that I still struggle to see how, given the certain setup, how we can have dead people and illegals voting to a degree that's going to overturn an election. And I just feel like, and this is me saying what I feel. So I want to be clear. These are my views. My views are not the views expressed by the channel. But these are my views. And I at this point, it becomes a bit dangerous now, where you really start pushing this narrative and you're continuing to divide a country when you have a new leadership coming into place, and you're just gaslighting people. This is, to me, gaslighting. There's just, you're saying shit and seeing what happens. You're just trying to get something to stick at this stage. And I just don't understand how we can have a targeted campaign to overturn 8 million votes or to cast 8 million votes without anyone knowing. It just doesn't make sense, and it just keeps going.
Yeah, that's how it appears to me too. But again, I don't follow it and I don't know. But I'd be interested to hear what evidence they have to kind of prove that some of these claims that is made, that potential dead people have voted or not. Like, you know, if they have got something bringing to the table, I'm all ears. It's just that all I'm hearing again is, or what I've seen on this channel, because I don't really follow the news, is just kind of accusations. I'm not one that kind of listens wholeheartedly to accusations. I'll always hear people out, but you got to follow it up more than that. It can't just be a shot in the dark. Well, this might have happened. Well, it might not have happened though. So what have you got to suggest that it does? Because what you said's pretty bold. Let's see what you've got to kind of back that up.
It's how bold it is, which is surprising. It is the scale of fraud that would have to go on would be just, you know, I want to use the word unfathomable. Yeah, I shouldn't have even tried to use that word.
You
know what I'm. Yeah, I think I did. I'll just say unfathomable. I'll just say it really quick. But to be able to organize people that have ID, because George actually said, after it was last week, about a week and a half ago, they said, because people are being such assholes about this, I'm paraphrasing, but because people are being such assholes about this, we're going to do an audit of the election, and we're just going to go back and check. And what'll happen, and this happens in every election worldwide because people make errors, there's going to be like a 0.25% difference in votes, because they're going to find that there's a few people that manage to put a vote in for their dead uncle or dead aunt.
It's human error. It's human error. We make mistakes, so there probably is going to be some level. I would be in agreement. I would be actually shocked if it was exactly the same.
Yeah. So now what we're saying is, let's I think it was 10,000 votes. Let's say. So now we need to somehow come up with enough foreign people who can forge identification, or enough dead people that we can target and get willing relatives or people to somehow get their identification and get a ballot and send that ballot in, and somehow nobody will know what's going on, because the choreography that would have to go into such a successful campaign would be impossible to cover up. And we do have a comment from Dot. The election fraud must be proven. Fraud was being discussed before the election. Well, yeah, it was discussed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the only one that was discussing fraud by mail-in votes. And I'm not surprised that we're still getting fraud. And the election is always investigated. They always audit check. They always do checks. It's part of the process. And Georgia's part of the process.
Again, I made that point previously, on another episode. I think it might have been 1 or 2 ago. But there is always election fraud. For people to think that it's ever 100% kosher is just it's just a shame, really, because if we don't think that there are deals and votes and stuff being happen under the table, or because of this, if I pay you this, and there are business and government kind of dealerships, I've seen enough movies behind it. I've heard people speak on podcasts that have looked into doing this and what it takes to run in office, and enough to know that it's a very dirty scene, having not gone through it. So I think fraud is to a level where people are going to be voting for reasons outside of who they want in office, because being forced into it for whatever reason, or having some bargaining tool or some agreement made. It's just that we want to keep that fraud to an absolute minimum. I think that's their point. And I agree with your point wholeheartedly, that I think it must be proven. We can air it out. We can listen to it. It must be proven. And the thing that bothers me is what Sean has said, and your second point there, which is it was discussed before the election. I didn't like that. You're kind of going into it already. It was just kind of, he was setting himself. It's again, this is me, Hughes science again, giving his take on it. It sounded like he was setting himself up for failure, and this is his backup plan if it went wrong. It's just a real weak leadership move to kind of complain about something prior to it happening. Like going into a sporting event saying the referees are terrible and make terrible calls.
Yeah.
And you go into it, and then I lost. Oh, where the referee was, I kind of said that before. It's cowardly. It's pathetic. It's it could be accurate, but it's so distastefully done. If you think that's the case, be quiet. Then if there is something that's been done that's been unjust from a referee standpoint, then bring up the evidence behind it, and then follow through with it. Do it the right way.
The last election he won, he claimed there was widespread voter fraud. And he said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that they were bussing in illegals to vote in states where you still need ID. And he said that's why his margin wasn't as big as it was, which I think is more of his narcissism coming through. He just doesn't fathom that people didn't vote for him. He's amazing. Yeah. And so he went from saying that the polling places are, people are being bussed in. There's wide rampant voter fraud. And now he's saying, if you want to safely vote, you need to go to the polling places to vote, not vote by post. So it's like, okay, well, so none of the voting is, and there's the thing is too, that, so there's, if you ever get a chance, and you probably would, Dot, if you ever get a chance, there's a place called the Brennan Center, which is a Republican think tank, So that's the party of Donald Trump, who's been collecting every historical instance of voter fraud that's ever been documented. And I think it represents something like 0.275% of the overall votes were impacted by voter fraud. It's some innocuous number like, I don't know, like 200,000 votes over the course of every historical election. And a lot of those instances of fraud usually come down to actionable plans. So things such as what they call harvesting votes. So going to where you can get, let's say, an older person, they get to post in their vote. You can go and you fill in this form, make sure you vote for Trump, and then I'll come and I'll collect it. Or make sure you vote for Biden. And then what you do is you go through this campaign to make sure you're collecting all the votes you want. And I think in some states that's legal. But there's instances where those ballots are sent in and somebody takes those ballots from a post office and throws them in the river or something like that. And usually it's about 2,000, 4,000, even 10,000 votes. I think the biggest voter fraud, prosecuted voter fraud was like 20,000 votes. But on the scale of balance, and I know in Georgia it was 10,000 votes, but these are smaller elections. It's easier to get away with because there's less bureaucracy protecting the sanctity of those smaller elections. The presidential election, every state has just tons of regulation that goes into registering to vote, and also how they train people and how they count those votes. In Pennsylvania, you have two teams going, that looks like Biden. Does that look like Biden? That looks like Biden. Okay, we're going to mark it as Biden. And then we have another team who checks it, says, yep, that's Biden. Let's move it on. Count that. So it's not as if it's that easy to get one by the keeper when it comes to 60 to 70 million. No, what was it? So it was 150 million people voted. It wasn't that much. It was 80 and 70 million, I think, the votes the president and the president-elect got. So there's just this whole feasibility conversation that's not being had. You're claiming something that has never been proven statistically, even remotely close. You're claiming there's a new paradigm of cheating going on that would require wide-scale investment and time and coordination to a point where it would almost be impossible to cover up. And Dot's got another comment. To combat fraud and silence the skeptics, perhaps voting should be secured with bank ID. They use an ID provided by the bank here to verify identity. It's interesting because this was the same, Veg last week was commenting, and that seems to be a popular comment from a lot of our viewership, is seeing more strict ID. And for me, I personally don't disagree with that. And using bank ID, yeah, I mean, you banks have IDs. Everyone usually has a bank account. Most people do. And identity verification is something that's quite key when it comes time to registering the vote. There's some states that are not sure about that because there's not been enough evidence to state, and this is something where I think is an arguable point. There's not been enough evidence to state that the lack of voter ID has caused widespread fraud, where it's changed the outcome of an election. And the view is, and we said this last week, the view is if you add voter ID as a requirement to put in a vote as a citizen, which you can't necessarily confirm, then that's going to eliminate the people who don't have means to a ID. You're blocking people who maybe don't have education or don't have money to getting an ID. I don't know where I sit on that. I genuinely don't know where I sit, because to get an ID shouldn't be difficult in itself. And I don't have any problem with being asked for an ID when I go to vote. but I also am not somebody who's poor or uneducated.
Yeah, I don't know. It's, again, I don't think there's one answer to fix this, but I think what Fed was suggesting, what Dot's suggesting, makes total sense to me, and having some form of verification. The idea I think that was floated was maybe an online vote, that everyone goes online, and then you have to counter that not everyone is online. I know most people are, but not everyone is, and technology is easy for the younger or middle age, but the elderly, it's a no-go, and they have a right to vote too. So I think this seems like a good compromise, where it's just it's kind of a continuation from what's currently in place, like the in-person voting with ID, or if you did a mail-in, you had a copy of your ID with it or something, with a signature, is a step in the right direction, perhaps.
Yeah, where I'm a bit torn, and this is where I'm going to be a bit sort of in the middle, is when you look at somebody who's disenfranchised, and this is opening a can of worms, and this isn't me saying I think it. There's a large percentage of people in the United States that are disenfranchised, that are discriminated against. Now, we can argue to what scale, but I think there is discrimination in the U.S. I don't think there's much argument about that to a degree. And is it more important that they have, so they're not going to want to register themselves on a system that they feel is going to disenfranchise them, or is going to use their identification or details to, maybe put them in prison? We've seen countless videos, and we're going to see more negative than positive videos. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not saying that it happens all the time and police are bad. I'm not saying that. But we do see a lot of videos, or a lot of instances, where justice does skew to the side of people that have money and have an education, or people that in the States are whiter than most. And because of that, you can see why people don't want to be pulled over by the police or be registered on any system, because they feel that's going to be their ticket to being, wrongly accused or arrested, or it sounds ridiculous, but to somebody who is disenfranchised, it doesn't. And then the question is it more important to give them a voice and allow them to vote if we have no data to say that there is widespread voter fraud when people don't produce an ID? Or, should we be looking at making sure everybody has an ID? What doesn't sit well with me is this whole push for identification is based off of claims that aren't backed by evidence. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think ID should be used, but I think that this isn't a conversation that we can say ID is a no-brainer. It's not necessarily.
Yeah, it's a fair point you bring to the table. I think there's more right with it than wrong. Is my uneducated guess of where my current stance of where I'm at with it. I think you bring a strong point to the table. There is a negative side effect from it, but as a result, I think it's kind of leaning in the right direction. And from someone going through property development at the moment, property investing, I need to prove all of my funds to have a privilege, which voting is a privilege, to be in a position. I have to provide proof of funds, proof of where my funds came from. It's anti-money laundering. Is to show where the money's coming from, and have screenshots of all my bank accounts and stuff like that. Then you're like, why do you need all this stuff? It's like, in case you're a bad guy, you're a drug dealer, you're using this money from illegal. I was like, but what percentage of people are doing that? Like, so everyone at 99.9% of people have got to do this. For the 0.01%, it's like, okay, well, it's the only way to do it. So if it is a hard stance on it, and look, I don't think there's really many people going into the realm of property investing or getting a mortgage and that enjoys doing anti-money laundering. It's just part of you just got to do it. And I think that it maybe isn't ideal, and there are new concerns that come up as a result of this. Again, I don't think it's about trying to find a silver bullet. I think it's about just trying to find a system that's slightly better than what we've currently got. And I think the ID checks are a move in that direction, whichever route you go down, whether it was, in person or a bank ID in this case, or passport or driver's license or something. It's a difficult issue, isn't it? I think we just got to admit that as well.
I think I agree. I think I lean towards saying, not necessarily voter ID. I think voter ID sounds very sort of Third Reichish. Do you have your papers kind of thing? But I also at the same time think everybody should have some identification as a safety valve if you get hit by a car or you get arrested for doing something wrong, which touches on some of the concerns people would have. I think having identification as to who you are, and I'm not talking about having identification so you were forced to produce it to a police officer who's just asking you why you're standing out front of your house sweeping. I think it's just good to have identification for things such as banking and, to protect yourself from fraud, for voting as well. And I think it's more about making the means to getting identification clearer, but also limiting the access and, how people use ID against you as a person. It shouldn't be a tool to use against you. It should be a tool that you can use to protect yourself. And protecting your vote, I think, is protecting yourself as well. You have a voice. You don't want somebody taking that vote to support something that is contrary to what you're about.